4 days before she died, Dolly Parton was still talking about the future. She said there were so many things she still wanted to accomplish. She was healing, she was working, she was making plans. Then on August 25, 2026, the girl from the Smoky Mountains, who turned poverty into poetry and heartbreak into songs the world would never forget, was gone at 80 after a brief battle with cancer. Only months earlier, standing at Dollywood, she had declared, "I ain't near done." And she truly believed it. She had written more than 3,000 songs and helped place more than 300 million books into the hands of children. Yet Dolly still believed she had more left to give. She was still building, still looking ahead. She was preparing to continue, not preparing to say goodbye. Behind the rhinestones and that familiar smile was a final chapter far more painful than most people understood. After Carl Dean, her husband of nearly 60 years, died in March 2025, Dolly admitted that grief had worn her down and that while caring for him, she had pushed parts of her own health aside. Plans changed. Appearances were canceled. The Las Vegas return she had once hoped to make would never happen. Still, she kept writing, creating, giving, and reaching toward another tomorrow. Then time stopped before the work did. The woman who had spent a lifetime turning hardship into music, opportunity, and comfort for millions left behind dreams she fully expected to fulfill. Before we continue, if Dolly ever carried you through heartbreak, loneliness, or one of the hardest years of your life, leave a like in her memory, a small tribute to a woman who reached the end, still believing she had more to give. The answer to Dolly's lifelong need to keep moving was written into her childhood. In the Parton household, standing still was a luxury few people had. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, in Sevier County, Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children of Robert Lee Parton and Avie Lee Owens Parton. Their mountain home had no electricity or indoor plumbing, and when Dr. Robert F. Thomas delivered her, her father paid him with a sack of cornmeal because cash was scarce. Robert Lee moved between sharecropping, farming, and construction work to support the family. Avie Lee had all 12 children by 35, yet Dolly remembered a mother who could make even scarcity feel personal rather than anonymous. She filled the house with Appalachian songs and stories, and sometimes made stone soup, asking the children to bring her stones, and choosing the one brought by whichever child she sensed needed a little more attention that day. 12 children meant food, clothes, chores, younger siblings, and responsibility had to be shared. Dolly was learning an instinct that would stay with her for 80 years. When life became difficult, you kept moving because other people were depending on you. When Dolly was 9, that responsibility became attached to one tiny life. Avie Lee sometimes told an older child that the next newborn would be your baby, meaning that child would help rock, change, and watch over the infant in a house already overflowing with children. Larry was assigned to Dolly. She could hardly wait for him. She sang toward her mother's belly and imagined the ordinary little duties that would soon be hers. Larry arrived in 1955 and survived only a very short time. Dolly never forgot him. Looking back decades later, she remembered how foreign such a loss was to her as a child and said it just absolutely killed me. She had prepared herself to become his protector. Then suddenly there was no baby to rock, no little brother to help raise, no future in which those plans could become memories. The experience affected the entire family. And for Dolly, it carried an especially intimate ache because Larry had already become her baby in her imagination. In a house filled with 11 surviving siblings, she discovered painfully early that the presence of many people could never replace the one person who was missing. Robert Lee Parton gave his daughter a different lesson. One Dolly would carry much farther than the Smoky Mountains. He could work the land, understand people, calculate, negotiate, and solve practical problems with an intelligence she admired deeply. What he could not do was read or write. Dolly later wondered aloud what her father might have become if education had ever been available to him, saying, "My daddy was so smart." She watched a capable man work relentlessly while knowing that one missing opportunity had narrowed the boundaries of his life. At the same time, music was quietly widening hers. Her mother's family was musical. Church gave Dolly an early place to sing, and as a child she could turn a tin can into a pretend microphone and the family porch into a stage. She had almost nothing resembling a professional beginning. Yet she had already learned two things that Nashville would eventually underestimate. Work did not frighten her, and disappointment did not automatically make her stop. Another lesson was waiting at school, however, and this one would arrive wrapped around her shoulders. One winter, Avie Lee took pieces of leftover fabric and made her daughter a coat. As she worked, she told Dolly the biblical story of Joseph and his coat of many colors, turning scraps the family could afford into something the child considered precious. Dolly went to school proud. That detail matters because the wound did not begin with embarrassment. It began with pride. She saw her mother's labor, attention, and love stitched into every piece. Other children saw patches. Their laughter taught Dolly that the same object could carry two completely different meanings. Inside her home, it was evidence of being loved. Outside it, it became evidence that her family had very little money. Dolly eventually refused to let that schoolyard have the final word. In 1971, she turned the memory into Coat of Many Colors, one of the songs she would later regard as especially important because of the philosophy beneath it. Her mother had taught the children that wealth could exist in spirit, family, and love, even when money did not. What once marked Dolly as a poor mountain girl became one of the clearest statements of who she was. Years after the teasing ended, the memory still had enough force to follow Dolly onto a tour bus with Porter Wagoner. When the song finally came together, she had no proper paper nearby, so she took a dry cleaning tag from one of Porter's outfits and began writing on it. She kept that tag. More revealing was what she later told the Library of Congress. The childhood hurt had returned again and again, but after completing the song, I felt released from the hurt. That sentence captured a skill Dolly would use throughout her career. She did not need to pretend the humiliation had never happened. She could decide what it produced. The patched coat became a song instead of a scar she had to hide. Her mother's storytelling became part of her own language. The mountains became creative identity rather than something to smooth away for Nashville. Even the ridicule had been stripped of its authority. The classmates who once saw poverty in the coat could not control what millions of listeners would eventually hear in it. Pride, belonging, imagination, and the stubborn dignity of a child who knew the garment was valuable before anyone else agreed. By the time Coat of Many Colors appeared in 1971, Dolly had already spent years discovering how often the music business tried to assign value from the outside. She had moved to Nashville immediately after graduating from high school in 1964 and signed with Monument Records the following year. Early recordings brought limited success, but songwriting began opening doors. Songs written with her uncle Bill Owens became hits for other artists, and her own Dumb Blonde gave her a first significant country breakthrough. In 1967, her debut solo album, Hello, I'm Dolly, helped bring her to Porter Wagoner's attention, and then on to his nationally syndicated television show. Each step enlarged the audience, but it also enlarged the pressure to fit somebody else's idea of what a young woman from East Tennessee should be. The coat had taught Dolly something useful before any contract could. Outsiders might judge the surface first, but they did not get the final word on its value. Once television widened her audience, that lesson became professional rather than personal. The opportunity was real, but so was the risk of being defined by the platform. The harder question was whether she could keep growing without allowing gratitude or another star's shadow to define the boundaries of her own career. What had once been a schoolyard argument over a patched coat was becoming an adult argument over authorship, direction, and who would be allowed to decide what Dolly Parton was worth. Pressure was already building behind Dolly Parton's smile by 1970. 3 years into the Porter Wagoner show, her voice was entering American living rooms every week, and the partnership had given her the national visibility she once could only imagine in the Smoky Mountains. Yet success came with a boundary. Many people still saw her as Porter Wagoner's duet partner, while Dolly was writing with a voice too personal and independent to stay inside another performer's frame. Creative disagreements sharpened as her solo ambitions grew. She was grateful to Wagoner, but gratitude could not become a permanent surrender of direction. In 1974, after 7 years on the show, she finally left. Instead of turning the separation into a public battle, she carried him a song. Dolly later explained the message of "I will always love you." Simply, "Just because I'm going, don't mean I won't love you." Wagoner cried when she sang it and agreed to let her go while producing the record. The farewell reached #1 on the country chart. A professional break that could have ended in bitterness became a declaration of independence without erasing gratitude. Jolene had already warned Nashville what that independence could sound like. Released in late 1973, its spare plea and unforgettable tension became Dolly's second #1 country single and earned a Grammy nomination. Still, one hit did not erase years of being underestimated. Producers, executives, and critics could admire the image while missing the discipline beneath it. Some still expected her future to remain attached to a male star. Dolly answered by working. Tours, television tapings, radio promotion, recording sessions, guitar practice, and songwriting left little room for rest. Hotel rooms and tour buses became writing spaces because the schedule rarely offered anything better. The pressure was especially sharp for a woman insisting on control of her songs, sound, and public image in a business largely run by men. She later remembered entering those rooms without intimidation. "I have a good product here." By 1977, "Here You Come Again" reached #1 on the country chart and #3 on the pop chart. When purists questioned the crossover, Dolly's own view was clear. "I love country music. It's my first love." But it was confining. She was widening the road without surrendering where she came from. Hollywood widened the gamble in 1980. Dolly made her film debut beside Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin in 9 to 5 while recording, promoting, and maintaining a music career already running at full speed. She memorized the script before filming, even learning other actors' lines, and during downtime tapped her acrylic fingernails to imitate a typewriter until the rhythm helped shape the title song. 9 to 5 reached #1 on the country, pop, and adult contemporary charts, won 2 Grammys, and brought her an Academy Award nomination. The success did not lighten the workload. Filming, studio sessions, travel, interviews, radio promotion, and touring kept colliding. As the industry shifted through the mid-1980s, Dolly kept writing rather than surrendering her identity to every new fashion. Tennessee Homesick Blues reached #1 in 1984. Why'd You Come In Here Looking Like That did it again in 1989. By decade's end, the woman once treated as somebody else's supporting voice had become a songwriter, solo star, actress, and cultural force. She had spent years winning the right to choose her own direction. At 36, however, a future far more personal than any career decision was moving beyond her control. At 36, the public saw a woman near the summit. Her body was forcing an entirely different conversation. In 1982, severe gynecological problems, intense pain, and persistent bleeding forced Dolly Parton to cancel a concert tour and undergo repeated medical treatment. She later spoke openly about endometriosis, and during this broader period she underwent a partial hysterectomy. Dolly also made clear that she had already been unable to have children before the operation. For a woman who grew up as one of 12 children in a home filled with babies, siblings, and constant family life, that reality carried a private weight no chart position could change. Motherhood had once belonged somewhere inside the future she imagined. Success could open stages, films, contracts, and entire new audiences, but it could not create that life for her. At the same time, another part of her private world was breaking apart. Dolly later described those months as involving a personal heartbreak. She never publicly identified the person, saying only, it was a love, illness, exhaustion, family strain, infertility, and that private loss converged until Dolly eventually described the period in 2 devastating words: a complete breakdown. The collapse lasted far beyond the physical crisis. Dolly said the depression continued for about 18 or 20 months, remembering simply, "I wasn't doing too well." The public still expected rhinestones, quick humor, enormous energy, and a woman who seemed capable of carrying any schedule placed in front of her. Privately, she was dealing with emotional distress that work could no longer disguise. Dolly later spoke about feeling angry, hurt, deeply unhappy, and struggling to understand what had happened to the life thought she was building. In later recollections of that lowest period, her little dog, Popeye, became part of the memory, Dolly, associated with an interruption in the downward pull of her thoughts. She interpreted that interruption through the faith that had shaped her since childhood, even reflecting on the strange closeness of the words dog and God. Dolly did not describe the moment as a cure, and it did not resolve the illness, the heartbreak, or the months of depression that followed. Asked years later how severe that crisis had become, she answered simply, "I don't know." For once, discipline was not enough. The body required treatment. The mind required time. Survival came before any question of returning to the schedule. Recovery came slowly and without one dramatic turning point. Dolly returned to the things that had steadied her since childhood: faith, family, humor, writing, and eventually work. She later described songwriting as a form of therapy, a way to let time pass before approaching pain with enough distance to put it into words. During work on Rhinestone, Sylvester Stallone entered her life at a vulnerable moment, and Dolly remembered his energy as really healing. She began recording, performing, and rebuilding without pretending the breakdown had vanished from her history. Years later, she said she had never learned to harden her heart. Instead, she had learned to strengthen the muscles around it. That line mattered because Dolly's recovery was never a story about becoming invulnerable. She had needed medical care. She had needed other people. She had needed months in which productivity could no longer be the measure of whether she was all right. When steadier ground finally returned, she carried a different understanding of strength. Continuing did not require denying what had happened, and among the people still connecting Dolly to doll childhood, faith, music, and the oldest version of herself was her mother, Avie Lee. Losing her would open a different wound, one rooted not in survival, but in the woman who had given Dolly's earliest songs a place to begin. Grief changed the meaning of one of Dolly Parton's most personal songs in 2003. That year, her mother, Avie Lee Parton, died at 80, and Coat of Many Colors stopped being only a memory of childhood. Avie Lee had been the first person to turn Dolly's imagination into something that could survive on paper. When Dolly was still too young to read or write, her mother made her a corncob doll with corn silk hair. Dolly began singing about it, and Avie Lee wrote down the words to Little Tiny Tasseltop, preserving what became her daughter's first song. Years later, the same woman would sew together the scraps that became the famous coat, teach 12 children that worth could exist without money, and fill a crowded Tennessee home with Appalachian songs, stories, faith, and humor. Even the family's stone soup ritual carried that instinct. Avie Lee would choose the stone brought by the child she sensed needed a little more love that day. Dolly's gift for turning hardship into story did not begin in a recording studio. It had been modeled for her by a mother who knew how to make limited things carry enormous meaning. After Avie Lee became ill and then passed away, Dolly discovered that fame could preserve a song without protecting the singer from what the song contained. Speaking years later about Coat of Many Colors, she admitted that during her mother's illness and after her death, it was all I could do to get through that song. Some performances brought tears. The audience heard a country classic. Dolly was returning to the woman who had sewn the coat, saved her earliest lyrics, and taught her that being poor did not require feeling small. That difference made the song harder, not easier, with time. The melody had once carried pride over a patched coat. After 2003, it also carried absence. Dolly kept performing because performing was part of her life. Yet the emotional center of the song had changed permanently. No award could make Avie Lee present again. No standing ovation could turn the lyric back into a memory untouched by loss. Every time Dolly sang it, the song asked her to stand inside both gratitude and grief at once. A.V. Lee's death did not erase her influence. It made that influence impossible to overlook. Dolly continued speaking about her mother's stories, humor, faith, cooking, handmade gifts, and the practical tenderness that had held a large family together. She carried those traits into songs, films drawn from childhood, philanthropy, and the way she spoke about people who had very little. Her mother had given her more than material for Coat of Many Colors. She had shown her how to keep dignity intact when resources were thin, and how to notice the person in a room who needed extra care. That inheritance stayed visible long after 2003. Dolly could point to hit records and international fame, but the earliest proof of her gift still led back to A.V. Lee, writing down a little girl's words before that child could write them herself. In that sense, one of the world's most prolific songwriters began with a mother acting as her first scribe. A.V. Lee had shaped the girl Dolly became. More than 2 decades after losing her mother, Dolly would face the loss of the man who had spent nearly 60 years beside the woman that girl grew into. Carl Dean knew Dolly before the world did, and losing him would leave a place in her life that fame could never fill. When they met outside the wishy-washy laundromat in 1964, 18-year-old Dolly had just arrived in Nashville with ambition, but no guarantee that the city would ever know her name. They married 2 years later. As television, records, movies, Dollywood, and international fame transformed her public life, Carl deliberately remained outside the spectacle. He worked in asphalt paving and later owned a paving company. He preferred privacy, road trips in their recreational vehicle, and a life that did not require cameras to validate it. That difference became part of their marriage rather than a threat to it. Dolly could spend weeks belonging to audiences and still return to someone who had known her before the costumes, awards, and mythology. In 2016, they renewed their vows for their 50th anniversary. Their marriage would last almost 60 years, not because Carl became part of Dolly Parton the celebrity, but because he remained central to Dolly the woman. March 3, 2025 changed the rhythm of a life Dolly had shared since she was 18. Carl died in Nashville at 82, and the farewell remained private in keeping with the way he had lived. 4 days later, Dolly released "If You Hadn't Been There," a song written for the man whose presence had stretched from her first Nashville dreams through almost every milestone that followed. Her accompanying message contained no elaborate explanation. "He will always be the star of my life story." Weeks later, she admitted that life without him required relearning routines built across decades. "It's a big adjustment just trying to change patterns and habits." She said even hearing people mention him could make her emotional. After a Dollywood appearance brought those feelings close to the surface, she later recalled getting into a van and crying for a long time. Work gave the day's structure. Messages from fans brought comfort, but neither could reproduce the ordinary familiarity of the person who had been beside her for most of her adult life. The loss lived in repetition suddenly interrupted. Patterns, habits, jokes, silences, and private knowledge accumulated across nearly 6 decades. Exhaustion eventually revealed another cost of devotion. During Carl's long illness, Dolly focused heavily on caring for him while her own medical needs received less attention. She later acknowledged that plainly. "I didn't take care of myself." After his death, appointments, procedures, and periods of recovery began taking space that Dolly had spent decades giving to work and to other people. The woman famous for extraordinary stamina had spent Carl's final chapter looking outward, toward the man who had shared almost 60 years with her. Once he was gone, she could no longer postpone listening to herself. Carl's death therefore ended more than a marriage. It removed the private continuity that had remained steady while her public life expanded beyond imagination. Grief forced new routines. Her own health forced new limits. By then, the issue was no longer whether Dolly knew how to keep working. She had proved that for a lifetime. The question was whether her body would allow her to keep working on the terms she had always demanded of it. Medical care was taking a larger place in her days, and Dolly could no longer treat her own health as something she would simply deal with later. Only 6 days before her death, Dolly Parton was still speaking the language of continuation. On August 19, appearing virtually to accept the ACM Poets Award, she returned to the craft that had carried her through nearly every chapter of her life. "Songwriting has been my therapy. Songwriting has been my release, my joy," she said. 2 days later, while acknowledging a difficult period of health, Dolly was still looking ahead. "I still have so many things I want to achieve," she said. Her public life had slowed, and medical care was demanding more of her time, but the vocabulary remained unmistakably forward-facing: healing, working, planning, creating. On August 25, Dolly Parton died in Nashville at 80. Her representatives later said she had faced a brief battle with cancer. She had spent more than 6 decades finishing songs, albums, films, businesses, tours, and ideas. This time there was no question of determination. Her plans had not run out, her time had. Confirmation came through the man Dolly herself had chosen years earlier to deliver it. Brian Seaver, the son of her sister Cassie and Dolly's head of security for more than 2 decades, appeared in a video posted through her official social media accounts on behalf of the Parton and Owens families. His father, Larry, had held that role before him. Brian had grown from a boy who sometimes traveled on the road with his aunt into one of the people entrusted with protecting the private woman behind an extraordinarily public life. "This video announcement is something Dolly asked of me years ago," Brian explained before confirming the passing of his aunt, Dolly Rebecca Parton Dean. For years, his responsibility had been to help preserve the boundary between Dolly's public existence and the parts of her life she kept for herself. The final responsibility she entrusted to him was different, announced that she was no longer there. Her official account carried one final message from Dolly: "I will always love you." The sentence had survived one farewell in 1974 and countless performances afterward. On August 25, it acquired a meaning Dolly would never have to explain. The calendar made the finality sharper. The Life of Many Colors Museum was preparing to welcome visitors inside Storyteller Hotel. Broadway previews for Dolly, a true original musical, were scheduled to begin December 7 at the St. James Theatre. Opening night was set for January 19, 2027, what would have been Dolly's 81st birthday. She had co-written the book with Maria S. Schlatter and created new songs specifically for the production. None of this belonged to the vague category of someday. Work had already been completed. Rehearsals and preparations had begun. Tickets were being sold. Dates existed independently of intention now, printed into schedules that assumed their creator would eventually arrive beside them. September, December, January 19. For most of a lifetime, Dolly had treated a date as a destination that could be reached through enough work. The final months exposed the one boundary work could not renegotiate. A person can fill a calendar farther into the future than a life will ultimately extend. She was not withdrawing from creativity because she believed the work was finished. She was still imagining additional achievements only days before death. Songs remained unwritten. Ideas remained capable of becoming projects. A Broadway opening waited on a birthday she expected to recognize. The loss was therefore larger than the work already completed. It included the unknowable portion of the work that would never receive a first draft, a melody, a title, or her decision that it was finally ready. Every artist eventually leaves finished work behind. Dolly also left creative possibility that could exist only through her. All the songs only she might have written, all the jokes only she might have made, all the decisions only she could have taken from instinct to reality. The calendar continued towards September, December, and January 19 without making any distinction between a date someone had planned and a date that person would never see. The future kept every appointment. Dolly could not. At 80, Dolly Parton had accumulated numbers large enough to define almost anyone else's life, and still none of them explained why she mattered. Records sold, awards collected, films made, businesses built, decades of applause. Those measured reach. The deeper measure lived somewhere quieter. People who never met Dolly carried her songs into marriages, separations, hospital rooms, long drives, childhood memories. In private moments when a familiar voice could make loneliness feel less complete. Coat of many colors gave dignity to people who understood what it meant to have very little. I Will Always Love You allowed love and departure to exist together without turning either person into a villain. Dolly became recognizable around the world while refusing to treat the Tennessee mountains that formed her as something she needed to outgrow. East Tennessee remained visible in her songs. Dollywood, jobs created close to home, family stories, and an accent she never polished away for anyone. Fame made her life larger. It never persuaded her to become embarrassed by the life that came first. Her father gave the clearest measure of what Dolly eventually chose to do with that success. Robert Lee Parton was intelligent, practical, and exceptionally hardworking, but he could not read or write. Dolly spoke openly about how deeply that limitation affected him. In 1995, she founded the Imagination Library partly in his honor, beginning with a simple promise that young children in their home county would receive free books before they entered school. Robert Lee lived long enough to watch the idea begin to grow. Dolly later remembered that children started calling her the Book Lady, and that title made her father prouder than the fame that had carried his daughter around the world. A man who could not read had become the emotional center of a program built around placing books into children's hands. For Dolly, that was the point beneath the statistics. She could not change what education had withheld from her father. She could decide that his limitation would not end as a private family sorrow. By June 2026, the Imagination Library had distributed more than 325 million books and was sending more than 3.5 million books every month across 5 countries. Behind those numbers were children opening packages addressed directly to them in homes Dolly would never see and families she would never meet. Dolly once said, "What we do for children will in the end be our legacy." Her father had lived with a door that illiteracy kept partly closed. His daughter spent more than 3 decades holding that door open for children, born long after his struggle began. She could not rewrite Robert Lee's childhood or return the opportunities education had denied him. She could make the same deprivation less likely to pass untouched into another generation. That became one of the clearest meanings of Dolly Parton's success. Not that she had traveled farther than anyone expected from the mountains, but that she used part of what she gained to widen the starting line for children coming after her. Robert Lee never needed to become famous for his life to matter. Millions of books carrying his daughter's promise became proof that what had limited one generation could still become protection for the next. Recognition never persuaded Dolly Parton to make herself smaller. The hair became higher, the clothes brighter, the jokes quicker, and the image so exaggerated that it often gave people permission to underestimate the woman inside it. Dolly understood that arrangement better than almost anyone. Spectacle could bring people to the door. Substance determined whether anything valuable was left behind. Her sermons gave listeners language for poverty, jealousy, separation, work, home, faith, and love. Her business decisions created employment. Her philanthropy put resources into needs that already existed. Success eventually gave Dolly choices unavailable to the girl who grew up in rural Tennessee. And one of the most revealing things about her life was how often she used those choices to increase somebody else's options. That usefulness could be counted in practical terms. After the 2016 Great Smoky Mountains wildfires, the My People Fund provided direct assistance to families who had lost their homes. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dolly donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, supporting research connected to the Moderna vaccine. She invested in literacy, education, healthcare, disaster relief, tourism, and employment in the region that had shaped her. Even at 80, the scale of those interests was still widening. In June 2026, She appeared at the opening of Dolly's Tensian travel stop in Cornersville, Tennessee, telling visitors, "The doors are open and I could not be prouder." That same month brought Cup of Ambition, a coffee brand inspired by 9 to 5. In August, her catalog received 82 new global sales certifications across 14 countries. None of those achievements was necessary to establish her status anymore. Their significance lay elsewhere. They represented jobs, commerce, royalties, audiences, tourism, charitable capacity, and economic value extending far beyond the person whose name appeared on them. That is where fame and legacy finally separate. Fame tells us how widely a person was known. Legacy asks what remained useful because that person had been here. Dolly left songs that give other singers material and listeners language for their own lives. Businesses that support workers and communities. Philanthropic programs that addressed specific needs. And an example for younger artists of how creative ownership could protect both income and independence. Her value cannot be reduced to how many people remember her photograph or recognize the opening notes of Jolene. The more demanding question is whether another person's circumstances became better, because Dolly Parton once had the ability to choose where her money, work, influence, and attention went. In millions of cases, the answer is yes. She became famous for being unforgettable. What made her legacy larger was how much of it another person could still use. If Dolly ever helped you through a hard season, leave one final tribute. Rip Dolly Parton.